Depression is a serious issue, especially for people in my generation. I know that it's a pretty big issue for people around my age. I just turned 19 recently, and yeah, I wanted to bring some awareness to depression and also kind of learn some more about it, what causes it, and also to learn more about what it feels like so that we, as people that aren't depressed, can be more thoughtful and respectful and understanding. And also, it's just interesting to learn about scientific stuff like this, so let's just get into it. Follow my Instagram, join my Discord, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. My goal is 500k by the end of the year, and we might not make it, but if we do, I will throw a party for all of us, okay? Anyway, first entry, sadness. Sadness is often the first word people reach for when talking about depression, but the two are not the same thing. Sadness is an emotion. It's temporary, tied to events, and it usually has a clear cause. Your dog is gone, you lose a game, you fail a test. Sadness comes in like a wave and eventually it passes. Depression, on the other hand, is more like being stuck in the ocean with no shore in sight. The tricky part is that when sadness lingers too long or comes too often, it can start to bleed into depressive symptoms. Biologically, sadness activates certain circuits in the brain, especially in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, and usually helps us learn and adjust. But if those circuits get overworked without relief, it's like a feedback loop that keeps reinforcing itself. That's where sadness stops being useful and starts becoming corrosive. Loneliness. Loneliness is a heavy hitter in depression research. It's not just about being physically alone. You can feel lonely in a crowd or even in a relationship that you don't understand. Studies show chronic loneliness actually changes the brain and body. Higher cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, weaker immune function. There's even evidence that loneliness activates the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury. That's why it feels so sharp and unbearable sometimes. Your body interprets it like you've actually been wounded. In terms of depression, loneliness is both a symptom and a cause. You withdraw when you're depressed, which makes you lonelier, which makes the depression worse. That cycle is brutal, and it's why social support is such a protective factor against depression. Insomnia. Sleep problems and depression are basically best friends in the worst way. Insomnia doesn't just mean you can't sleep. It can mean trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early. When you're depressed, your sleep-wake cycle often gets wrecked. The brain's regulation of serotonin and melatonin, two chemicals tied to both mood and sleep, get disrupted. Without quality sleep, your brain can't clear waste proteins properly, can't regulate emotions as well, and can't reset its stress response. Research shows people with chronic insomnia are much more likely to develop depression, and people with depression often struggle with insomnia as one of their earliest symptoms. It's a vicious cycle. The worse you sleep, the worse your mood, and the worse your mood, the harder it is to sleep. Social comparison theory. This one goes a little deeper into the psychology side. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory basically says we define ourselves by comparing our lives, bodies, and achievements to others. That wasn't always bad. Humans evolved in small groups, so comparing yourself to your tribe actually was a good thing. That's why it evolved. It helped you improve and survive. But in the modern age of Instagram and TikTok, it's like living in a hall of mirrors where everyone else's life looks shinier, hotter, and more successful. This is one that, I don't have clinical depression or anything, but I definitely have felt this, and I feel like most people are lying if they say that they haven't. Constant upward comparison, or comparing yourself to people better off than you, quote unquote, has been linked to higher rates of depression and anxiety. The brain literally lights up with feelings of shame and inadequacy when we scroll through feeds of people who seem to have what we don't. It's not just a thought pattern, it rewires self-esteem and can create chronic dissatisfaction with your own life. Breakup. Romantic breakups might be one of the most relatable triggers for depression. When you're in a relationship, your brain wires itself to your partner. Oxytocin and dopamine fire every time you connect, and your attachment system builds them into your sense of safety. Losing that bond is like ripping out a piece of your identity. Studies using brain scans show that people going through a breakup experience withdrawal symptoms similar to drug addiction. See guys, I always got to include drugs somewhere in all my scripts. But anyway, that's why it physically hurts. The same regions that light up for physical pain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, also light up for heartbreak. Now, I did not research this for the script, so I'm not taking this with a grain of salt, but I remember I heard somewhere somewhere, it's really fucking interesting, that apparently they say that for a breakup, one of the best things you can do is like take aspirin, because like it actually like feeds on the same part of your brain as pain, which is really interesting. I mean, I forget where I heard that, so it could have been like a Joe Rogan podcast, and I could just be talking shit, so don't actually do that, but I heard it somewhere. Breakups can lead into situational depression, where the sadness and loss spiral into something longer lasting. For some people, it's the first time they realize how fragile their mental state can be when their safe person disappears. Burnout. Burnout isn't technically the same thing as depression, but the overlap is huge. It usually shows up in people who are pushing themselves too hard for too long. Jobs, school, caregiving, even creative work. The core signs are emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and feeling like nothing you do matters. The science side is this. Burnout often ties back to prolonged activation of the HPA axis, which is the body's main stress pathway. When it never gets to shut off, cortisol builds up, sleep gets worse, motivation tanks, and your brain's reward system basically goes on strike. A lot of researchers argue that long-term burnout can morph into clinical depression, especially because both involve reduced dopamine and serotonin activity. So the line between the two isn't really clean. Sometimes burnout is depression in disguise. Low self-esteem. Low self-esteem is one of those chicken or the egg things with depression. Does feeling worthless cause depression, or does depression convince you you're worthless? Honestly, it's both. Psychologists point to negative cognitive schemas, mental templates that filter the world so you only notice your flaws and failures. Those patterns often form pretty early, like critical parents, bullying, trauma, and depression latches onto them like fuel. Brain-wise, studies show people with low self-esteem have reduced activity in reward circuits, meaning they don't get the same positive reinforcement from small wins as someone with healthier self-esteem. Over time, that flatness reinforces the cycle. You stop trying, you achieve less, you hate yourself more. It's like quicksand, it's really sad. Seasonal affective disorder. This is the classic winter blues but turned clinical. SAD usually hits in the colder months when daylight drops, messing with your circadian rhythms and your body's ability to regulate melatonin and serotonin. Less sunlight equals less vitamin D synthesis equals lower serotonin activity. The result is lethargy, carb craving, social withdrawal, and depressed mood. It's a very real biological condition. Light therapy lamps are often prescribed to trick your brain into thinking it's sunny outside. But here is something less talked about. There is evidence of an opposite version. Some people experience depression specifically in the summer, often called reverse SAD. Instead of sluggishness, they get agitation, restlessness, poor appetite, and even insomnia. Researchers think overheating, disrupted routines, and sensitivity to long daylight hours might play a role. Not to self-diagnose, but I relate to that second one, the reverse SAD. I mean, I don't think I'm depressed or anything, but I'm recording this right now on August 31st, 2025, and today is the first day that it's been in since fucking I don't know, like months that I could wear long sleeves, and dude, I am in one of the best moods ever right now. I hate the summer. Anyway, let's move on. Fatigue. Fatigue in depression isn't just being tired. It's this heavy whole body exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Depressed people describe it as dragging a weight through every task. Neurologically, fatigue ties back to how depression messes with neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, which are crucial for energy and alertness. Add in the fact that sleep is usually messed up, insomnia or oversleeping, plus high levels of inflammatory markers like cytokines in depressed patients, and your body literally feels sick. This is why fatigue is considered one of the somatic symptoms of depression. It hits the body just as much as the mind. Psychological stress. Stress is the silent partner of depression. Short bursts of stress can actually be motivating. Your body releases adrenaline, you focus, you act. But chronic stress is a different beast. It constantly floods the system with cortisol, which in turn shrinks part of the hippocampus, responsible for memory and mood regulation, and overactivates the amygdala, or the fear/emotion center. Over time, this imbalance makes your brain more vulnerable to depressive episodes. There's even a whole theory called the stress diathesis model that says depression often develops when life stress collides with genetic or biological vulnerability. So while stress doesn't cause depression itself, it's one of the most common triggers. And that was layer one of the iceberg, guys. I kind of went through that one very quick. I don't think that it's had many deep topics. So let's get into one of the deep layers, or a deeper layer, layer 2. Still gonna be a little bit simple, but that's why it's an iceberg. We're gonna get even more in depth as we go. Self-sabotage. Self-sabotage is when you quietly undercut your own success. procrastinating, missing deadlines, ruining relationships, whatever. On the surface, it looks irrational, but psychologically, it's usually about control. If you fail because you trip yourself up, it feels less terrifying than failing when you actually tried your best. Depression feeds this mindset because it convinces you that you're destined to fail anyway. Self-sabotage becomes a way of proving that negative belief to be true, which paradoxically feels safer than risking proof you might have been wrong. Brain-wise, it ties into the same reward circuits. The comfort of certainty outweighs the risk of growth. Internet addiction. The internet is both a coping tool and a trap. On one hand, you can find community, distraction, and validation. On the other, the endless scrolling and dopamine hits mimic addictive substances. Social media especially hijacks the brain's reward system with likes, novelty, and constant comparison. Research shows that heavy internet use is linked to higher depression and anxiety, though it's tricky to separate cause and effect. Are people depressed because they're online too much, or are they online too much because they're depressed? Likely both. It's probably another cycle. But it doesn't mean that if you're on the internet all day that it means that it's bad for you that you're depressed. I mean, for me, my entire job is the internet, and I'm not that depressed. I'm not depressed. Imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is when you feel like you don't deserve your achievements, and sooner or later, everyone or someone is going to find out that you're a fraud. It shows up a lot in high achievers, but depression makes it worse because it hijacks your self-perception. Even when you do something well, the brain discounts it, like, I got lucky, or it wasn't that hard, or anyone could have done it. The amygdala, threat detection, stays overactive, while the prefrontal cortex, the rational evaluation, struggles to calm it down. Over time, you live in constant fear of exposure, which fuels anxiety and depressive self-doubt. Hypersexuality. For some people, depression doesn't just blunt desire, it can swing the opposite way. In psychology, this is sometimes called hypersexual behavior, meaning using intimacy, fantasies, or compulsive habits as a way to cope with emptiness or pain. It's not about genuine pleasure, but more about distraction or self-soothing. It can overlap with bipolar disorder during manic phases, but it also appears in unipolar depression when people chase dopamine to escape numbness. The important nuance is that it's less about sexuality itself and more about compulsivity, another form of avoidance coping that leaves you feeling worse afterward, usually. Learned helplessness. This one's classic depression theory. Back in the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman did experiments where dogs were given unavoidable shocks. Later, when escape became possible, the dogs didn't even try. They'd learned that nothing they did mattered, and humans do the same. If you've been through enough failures, trauma, or neglect, you can start to believe that there's no point in fighting back. Depression locks onto that belief and hardwires it so you stop trying to improve your life even when escape routes exist. Neurologically, this shows up as underactivity in the striatum, or the motivation reward part, and overactivity in stress circuits. It's basically the blueprint for hopelessness. Rumination. Rumination is the mental hamster wheel, replaying the same negative thoughts or memories over and over without ever reaching a solution. People with depression often get stuck in this loop, which strengthens the neural pathways tied to sadness and shame. Imaging studies show that rumination heavily involves the default mode network, the brain's resting state that handles self-reflection. In depression, the DMN, or default mode network, goes into overdrive, making your thoughts fold back on themselves endlessly. The worst part is rumination feels like problem solving, but it never produces action, only more exhaustion. Substance abuse. A really common but dangerous way of self-medicating depression is substance abuse. Alcohol, nicotine, weed, or harder substances. They all provide temporary relief, usually by tweaking dopamine or calming stress hormones. The problem is they rebound hard. Alcohol deepens depressive symptoms by lowering serotonin. Stimulants crash into exhaustion. Even weed, while it might feel like it softens the edges, can worsen motivation and amplify rumination. This is often called a dual diagnosis when someone has both depression and substance use disorder, and treating one without the other rarely works. It's another feedback loop. You drink because you're depressed, and you're depressed because you drink. Anhedonia. Anhedonia is one of the most defining symptoms of major depressive disorder. It's the inability to feel pleasure. Things you used to love, music, music, foods, games, intimacy, all feel flat. This isn't just psychological, it's chemical. The brain's reward system, dopamine pathways in the nucleus, accumbens, and prefrontal cortex, basically goes offline. Without dopamine signaling properly, nothing clicks. What makes anhedonia terrifying is how invisible it is. From the outside, you might look fine, but inside, life has lost all its color. It's often one of the hardest symptoms to treat because medication that boosts serotonin doesn't always fix dopamine dysfunction. Catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is the mental habit of always imagining the worst possible outcome. For example, I texted her and she hasn't replied, she must hate me. Or, I'm late to work, I'll get fired and end up homeless. It's linked to cognitive distortions and depression where the brain exaggerates risk and ignores nuance. Evolutionarily, the brain is wired to anticipate threats, but in depression, the volume knob gets stuck on max. Functional MRI studies show catastrophizing is tied to overactivation in the anterior cingulate cortex, or error detection, and amygdala. Essentially, your brain acts like every little mistake is a life or death crisis, which keeps you trapped in constant anxiety and hopelessness. And that is the end of Layer 2, so let's get into Layer 3. SH is one of the darkest ways depression can manifest, and it usually isn't really about wanting to be gone. More often, it's about wanting to feel something different. For some, it's a way to convert emotional pain into something physical and tangible, something that they can control. Brain research suggests that in certain people, SH temporarily lowers stress hormones and triggers endorphins, creating a short-lived sense of relief, kind of like substance abuse. The tragedy is that the relief doesn't last, and shame usually follows, making it even worse. Mental health professionals emphasize that it's a signal of unbearable distress, not weakness. And breaking the cycle requires compassion, not judgment. I feel weird even mentioning this in one of my silly YouTube videos, like who the fuck am I to talk about this stuff? But please do not do this to yourself. And here on screen is a hotline number, and it's in the description too. I don't know, I want to take this seriously. I feel weird about this, but let's just move on. Depersonalization. Depersonalization is a dissociative symptom where you feel detached from yourself, like you're watching your life through a screen or you're not fully real. Depression can trigger it when emotions become so overwhelming that the brain sort of hits the emergency brake. The default mode network, or the DMN we talked about earlier, and prefrontal regions go into overdrive, cutting you off from sensory grounding to reduce overload. It's protective in the short term, but terrifying when it lingers. People often describe it as being trapped in a dream, numb to their own identity. While not unique to depression, it's also tied to anxiety and trauma. In the context of depression, it makes the illness feel even more alienating. Alexithymia. Alexithymia is the inability to put feelings into words. People who experience it aren't emotionless, they feel things, sometimes intensely, but they struggle to identify or describe those emotions. It's like trying to navigate without a map. Research suggests it's tied to reduced connectivity between the emotional centers, like the amygdala, and the language centers, like Broca's area of the brain. In depression, alexithymia can make recovery harder because therapy often depends on naming what you feel. It also creates a really awful sense of isolation. If you can't explain your inner world, it's easy to feel misunderstood. Maladaptive daydreaming. Daydreaming itself is harmless, even healthy, but maladaptive daydreaming is when it becomes compulsive and starts interfering with real life. People spend hours lost in elaborate fantasy worlds, sometimes pacing or listening to music to fuel it. For depressed individuals, it can act as an escape hatch from painful reality. The brain's default mode network is again involved here. It lights up during both daydreaming and rumination. The difference is, in maladaptive daydreaming, the imagination gets hijacked as a coping mechanism, replacing genuine engagement with the outside world. It feels safer, but it deepens isolation and keeps problems unsolved. Hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is the constant state of being on edge, scanning for threats that may not even exist. It's most commonly tied to trauma and PTSD, but depression can heighten it too, especially when the nervous system is locked into a stress response. Cortisol and adrenaline levels stay elevated, the amygdala stays overactive, and even harmless stimuli, like a text notification or a knock at the door, feel overwhelming. Living in hypervigilance is exhausting. It drains focus and makes rest nearly impossible. Over time, it blends into depression by reinforcing fatigue, hopelessness, and the sense that the world isn't safe. Dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia happens when the brain blocks out memories, usually of stressful or traumatic events. Unlike ordinary forgetfulness, it's not about the memory being erased. It's about the brain refusing to let it surface because it's too overwhelming. In depression, this sometimes shows up when trauma and mood disorder overlap. The hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which normally store and retrieve memory, shut down access as a defense. People with dissociative amnesia often experience gaps in their autobiographical memory, which can make depression worse. You feel disconnected from your own life story. The irony is that your brain thinks it's protecting you, but the missing pieces often create confusion, identity issues, and deeper hopelessness. Hikikomori. Hikikomori is a Japanese term for a condition where people withdraw from society completely, sometimes not leaving their rooms for months or years. While it's not officially classified as depression, the overlap is huge. Social isolation, avoidance, shame, and often untreated mental illness. Researchers debate whether it's a cultural phenomenon tied to Japan's rigid school work expectations, or if it's a universal expression of depression that just happens to be named there. Cases have since been documented outside Japan too. From a psychological angle, hikikomori can be seen as extreme avoidance coping mixed with social anxiety and depressive withdrawal. It's like loneliness and depression taken to their most literal form. Life shrinks down to four walls. Trauma bonding. Trauma bonding describes the unhealthy attachment that forms between someone and an abuser, usually through cycles of harm and reconciliation. The brain wires to the intermittent rewards, sometimes love, sometimes cruelty, in a way similar to gambling addiction. Dopamine spikes during the good moments, keeping the person hooked, while cortisol and fear dominate the bad ones. Depression ties in because being trapped in this kind of bond erodes self-worth and creates helplessness. It's not that people choose to stay, it's that their nervous system has been conditioned to see leaving as more dangerous than staying. Breaking a trauma bond is incredibly difficult, and survivors often need years of therapy to untangle the emotional knots. DIY medicine. When depression becomes unbearable and people feel abandoned by traditional healthcare, some turn to DIY medicine. That can mean self-medicating with alcohol or street drugs, buying antidepressants online without prescriptions, or using herbal supplements in unregulated ways. In extreme cases, it can even mean experimenting with risky treatments alone. The appeal is obvious: control, accessibility, desperation, but the dangers are equally clear. Wrong dosages, dangerous interactions, or counterfeit pills can all make depression worse, not better. On the flip side, the DIY medicine trend highlights how many people with depression feel failed by formal systems of care, either because of cost, stigma, or lack of access. It's less about recklessness and more about desperation for relief. And I'm sure that in our country, the great United States of America, it's a great thing that our president thinks that depression isn't real and got rid of the hotline number for America. That's the best thing we can do, right? That was sarcasm, satire, by the way. Thank God Canada exists, bro. Alright, and that was the end of Layer 3, so Layer 4 is next, and we're gonna get a little bit more deep stuff here. Ontological insecurity. This is a term from psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who used it to describe a fragile sense of self. Ontological insecurity means you don't feel solid or real in your own existence. Your identity feels shaky, boundaries between yourself and the world blur, and you're constantly anxious about disintegration. In depression, this shows up as a deep-rooted fear of being empty or fake, like you could dissolve at any moment. It overlaps with depersonalization and dissociation, but it's more existential. It's not just I feel unreal. It's I don't even trust that my being is secure. Absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophy most famously associated with Albert Camus. The idea that humans crave meaning, but the universe is silent. That gap, the absurd, is where depression often lurks. When you're depressed, life can feel stripped of meaning, and absurdism can be either liberating, there's no meaning so I'm free to create my own, or crushing, there's no meaning so why bother at all. For some, reading Camus or Kierkegaard Kierkegaard helps frame depression in a philosophical light. For others, it deepens the spiral. The absurd is basically the intellectual version of staring into the void. Existential crisis. An existential crisis is what happens when you question the point of everything. Your goals, identity, mortality, and the universe itself. It's not exclusive to depression. A lot of people hit this in their 20s or midlife, but when paired with depressive symptoms, it can become paralyzing. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's hub for big picture thinking, and when it locks on to what's the meaning of life without relief, it creates a kind of cognitive trap. For depressed people, the crisis often boils down to a sense of futility. Like again, if nothing matters, then I don't matter either. Self-disgust. This goes beyond self-hatred. Self-disgust is almost visceral, like being repulsed by yourself in the same way you'd react to something rotten or contaminated. Researchers call this the self-disgust scale in clinical studies, and it's been linked to severe depression, eating disorders, and trauma. Brain scans suggest the insula, a region that processes disgust, gets activated not just by external stimuli, but by self-reflection in people who report this. Depression uses this against you, making your own body, mind, or behaviors feel intolerable. It's one of the most corrosive forms of self-directed emotion. Cognitive distortions. These are the mental errors depression thrives on. Patterns of thought that are skewed and harmful. For example, all or nothing thinking, example, if I'm not perfect, I'm worthless. Overgeneralization, example, if I failed once, I'll always fail. And mind reading, example, they didn't text back, they must hate me. Aaron Beck, the father of cognitive therapy, identified these as the building blocks of depression. They're like funhouse mirrors in your brain. Everything is warped, but it's different because to you it feels accurate. Treating depression often involves learning to recognize and challenge these distortions so that they don't run the show. Anomie. Sociologist Emil Durkheim coined anomie to describe a state of normlessness, when society's rules and values break down, leaving individuals feeling lost. Depression can create a personal anomie where nothing feels structured or meaningful in your life. On a broader scale, living in chaotic or unstable societies, economic collapse, cultural dislocation, can fuel depressive states by stripping away the sense of belonging and purpose. It's a reminder that depression isn't only individual, it's also tied to the social environment we live in. Existential nihilism. This is the bleakest branch of nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning or value. A lot of people encounter nihilism intellectually, but in depression, it feels lived, a suffocating conviction that everything is pointless. Some philosophers, Nietzsche for instance, argued nihilism could be overcome by creating personal meaning. But when you're depressed, that leap feels impossible. Instead, nihilism often becomes a justification for despair. Like, if nothing matters, then why fight the depression at all? Solipsism syndrome. Solipsism syndrome isn't an official diagnosis, but it describes when someone feels trapped in the belief that only their own mind is real. It's sometimes reported by astronauts, people in extreme isolation, or those with dissociative depression. The world feels like an illusion, other people feel like actors, and reality itself feels questionable. Philosophical solipsism is a thought experiment, but in depression, solipsism syndrome is alienating, terrifying, a mix of derealization, depersonalization, and existential crisis all rolled together. Emptiness might be the single most universal description of depression. It's not sadness, not anger, not even numbness. It's the sense of being hollow inside, like something essential is missing. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional blunting or affective flat. Neurobiologically, it overlaps with anhedonia. Dopamine pathways fail to fire, so nothing fills the void. Existentially, it's the lived version of nihilism. Not just nothing matters, but I feel like nothing. It's one of the hardest states to put into words, which is why people often describe it metaphorically. A hole, a void, a hollow shell. And that's the end of this layer. I feel like these are kind of short layers. I don't know. That was layer 4 though, and quick check-in, just making sure you guys are good, get some water. If you need to talk to someone, the hotline again is in the description. And also, if you want some friends, join my Discord server. We talk in there a lot, but yeah, just, keep yourself okay, man. Self-care, But let's get into layer 5 now. Death drive. Sigmund Freud coined the term thanatos, or the death drive, as the counterpart to eros, the life drive. It's the idea that humans have an unconscious pull towards destruction, stillness, or returning to nothingness. In depression, the death drive sometimes shows up as self-sabotage, reckless behavior, or passive thoughts of escape. Not always literal death, but a yearning to stop existing. Freud's theory is not universally accepted, but modern psychology does recognize a similar phenomenon. When despair turns inward, the instinct for survival weakens, and people may unconsciously seek ways to end their own suffering. Weltschmerz. This is a German word that literally means world pain. It describes a sadness or weariness caused by recognizing that reality can never live up to your ideas. It describes a sadness or weariness caused by recognizing that reality can never live up to your ideals. Romantic poets in the 1800s used it to capture their melancholy, but it's also a very real depressive mindset, the constant ache of being disappointed in existence itself. Unlike clinical terms, Weltschmerz is more cultural and aesthetic. It's the mood of feeling out of place in the world, burdened by its flaws. People with depression often describe exactly this, a sadness not from one event, but from the whole state of things. Cotard's syndrome. One of the rarest and most disturbing psychiatric conditions, Cotard syndrome is sometimes called walking corpse syndrome. People with it genuinely believe they are dead, don't exist, or are missing internal organs. It's linked to severe psychotic depression and neurological damage. Neuroimaging suggests dysfunction in the parietal lobes, responsible for body perception, and prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning. It's not just delusion, it's a lived reality for the person, making it one of the bleakest possible overlaps between depression and psychosis. L'appel du vide, a French phrase meaning the call of the void. It describes that strange intrusive thought when you're standing on a ledge and your brain whispers, "What if you jumped?" Most people experience it occasionally, and it doesn't mean you want to die. Psychologists see it as a misfiring of the survival system, like the brain checking in with itself about danger. In depression, though, l'appel du vide can be more persistent and terrifying, feeding intrusive thoughts that add to despair. It's a chilling reminder of how the mind can betray its own instinct to live. Abulia. Abulia is a neurological or psychiatric symptom defined as an extreme lack of willpower. It's beyond ordinary procrastination. People with abulia struggle to initiate even the simplest actions, like picking up a glass of water. It's seen in depression, but also in conditions involving damage to the frontal lobes or basal ganglia. Neurobiologically, it's tied to dopamine dysfunction. The brain's go signal fails to fire. In depression, abulia manifests as the paralysis of motivation. You want to do things, but the bridge between thought and action is broken. Psychache, a term coined by suicidologist Edwin Schneidman. Psychache refers to unbearable psychological pain. Unlike sadness or grief, psychache is a mix of shame, guilt, loneliness, and despair, an all-encompassing torment. Schneidman argued that the desire to end one's life is often driven not by a desire for death itself, but by a desperate need to escape psychache. It's a concept that reframed depression in terms of pain rather than illness, highlighting that mental suffering can be just as lethal and genuine as physical disease. Atychiphobia. Atychiphobia is the intense fear of failure. In depression, this fear can dominate decision-making. People avoid risks, opportunities, or even small challenges, convinced they'll fail anyway. This fear isn't just anxiety. It often grows out of learned helplessness and self-criticism. The result is paralysis. No action feels safe, so life shrinks smaller and smaller. Over time, atychiphobia feeds depression by confirming its central lie that I can't succeed. Acedia, an ancient concept from early Christian monastic life. Acedia was described as a state of listlessness, apathy, and spiritual despair. Monks called it the noonday demon because it would hit hardest in the middle of the day, making prayer and work feel meaningless. Today, it reads almost exactly like depression: fatigue, emptiness, lack of motivation. Acedia shows how far back human beings have been wrestling with depressive states, even before before psychiatry gave them clinical names. Abulimania, related to abulia, but specifically about decision-making. Abulimania is the pathological inability to make choices, even trivial ones. Depression often makes small decisions feel monumental. Should I shower now or later feels impossible. Abulimania magnifies this into a paralyzing disorder, where the fear of making the wrong choice prevents any choice. It's another example of how depression hijacks executive function in the brain, leaving people trapped in indecision. Aphasagoraphobia, a phobia of being forgotten, ignored, or abandoned. While not formally recognized as a disorder, it's a powerful theme in depression. The fear that you don't matter, that people will move on without you. For some, this manifests in clinginess or anxiety in relationship. For others, it fuels deep isolation as they assume abandonment is inevitable. Depression amplifies this fear by whispering the worst case scenario, that your existence won't leave a mark. Smile mask syndrome, a term that came out of South Korea, where work and school often demand constant politeness and positivity. Smile mask syndrome describes the pressure to keep smiling even when you're suffering inside. It's similar to smiling depression, where someone appears functional and cheerful but is secretly battling severe depressive symptoms. The psychological toll of wearing a mask every day is exhaustion and alienation. You feel invisible because no one sees your real pain. And that was layer 5, guys. If you're still enjoying this video, be sure to, stay hydrated, get some water, get a snack if you need it, stay safe, and let's get into layer 6. Tedium vitae. Latin for weariness of life, tedium vitae, is an old term used in philosophy and literature to describe the exhaustion and boredom with existence itself. Unlike sadness or grief tied to a specific event, it's more like a blanket fatigue with living. In medieval times, it was considered a kind of spiritual illness linked to acedia. Today, it lines up almost perfectly with depression's emptiness and anhedonia. Disenfranchised grief. This is grief that society doesn't recognize or validate. Examples include mourning a pet, a miscarriage, the death of an ex, or even the loss of an identity or community. When the world tells you that's not something to grieve, but your heart still breaks, it creates isolation and shame. Depression feeds on disenfranchised grief because it strips away one of the most healing parts of loss, being allowed to share it openly. Without validation, grief festers into loneliness and despair. Gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the psychological distress that comes from a mismatch between someone's gender identity and their assigned sex at birth. It's not the same as depression, but the two often overlap because of stigma, social rejection, and the pain of living in a body or role that feels wrong. Brain scans suggest differences in certain brain structures in people with gender dysphoria, but what matters here is the lived difference. Depression is higher among trans people not because of who they are, but because of the world's response to them. Recognition, affirmation, and support are protective against both dysphoria and depression. Resignation syndrome. This is a haunting condition documented mostly among refugee children in Sweden. Kids facing deportation or traumatic uncertainty fall into a coma-like state. They stop eating, moving, or speaking, sometimes for months or years. It's thought to be an extreme stress response where hopelessness literally shuts down the body. Depression overlaps here through the same mechanism, where when the mind concludes there's no way out, the body collapses too. Resignation syndrome shows just how powerful psychological despair can be in shutting off basic survival drives. Psychogenic pain. Pain that has no clear physical cause but is very real nonetheless. Depression often rewires the brain's pain processing systems, making ordinary sensations feel magnified or creating pain out of psychological distress. Neuroimaging shows increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, areas tied to both emotion and pain perception. People with depression frequently report headaches, back pain, or stomach issues with no medical explanation. Psychogenic pain proves that the mind and the body are not separate. When one suffers, the other one does too. Ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss happens when someone is gone but not fully gone. A missing person, a loved one with dementia, a parent who abandoned you without closure. Unlike traditional grief, there's no clear endpoint, no ritual to process the loss. Psychologist Pauline Boss coined the term, and research shows it often creates prolonged depressive symptoms because the mind can't, finish mourning. Depression thrives on unresolved loops, and ambiguous loss is the ultimate unresolved loop. Ego depletion. The theory of ego depletion suggests that self-control is like a muscle. Use it too much and it gets tired. In depression, people often feel drained just from existing because constant rumination and emotional regulation wear down willpower. Even though recent studies question whether ego depletion is as strong a phenomenon as once thought, the lived experience is undeniable. When you're depressed, every small task feels Herculean because your mental fuel tank is always near empty. Hopelessness theory of depression. This is a cognitive model developed by psychologists Abramson, Matowski, and Alloy in the 1980s. It argues that depression is driven by a specific kind of hopeless thinking, believing that negative events are permanent, global, and your fault. For example, I fail this exam, therefore I'm stupid, therefore I'll always fail, therefore my whole life is ruined. That explanatory style predicts not just depression, but also self-life-ending thinking. The hopelessness theory is basically a scientific way of explaining how the brain's pessimism can become lethal when it calcifies. Prolonged grief disorder. This is when the grief doesn't ease with time but becomes stuck, lasting more than a year and impairing daily life. It's now recognized in the DSM-5 as a formal diagnosis. People with PGD often feel intense yearning, disbelief, or guilt that doesn't fade. Depression and prolonged grief overlap, but grief is often specifically tied to the loss, while depression spreads across everything. Still, PGD can spiral into depression if untreated. Somatization. Somatization is when psychological distress expresses itself as physical symptoms. People with depression often experience chest pain, stomach problems, or fatigue with no clear medical cause. It's not faking. The symptoms are real, but they're rooted in the nervous system misfiring from stress and mood dysfunction. Culturally, somatization is more common in places where talking about mental illness carries stigma. The body becomes the mouthpiece for unspoken suffering. For depression, somatization shows how mental pain doesn't stay in the head, but it can invade the whole body. And that was layer 6. Only a few left, guys. Let's go and get into layer 7. Mesotheism. Mesotheism literally means hatred of God. It isn't atheism, not believing, or agnosticism, being unsure, but a deep resentment toward the idea of a higher power. For depressed people, especially those raised religious, mesotheism can stem from the question, if God exists, why did he let me suffer? That bitterness can become part of the depressive worldview, a sense of betrayal by the universe itself. Psychologists sometimes frame it as a form of spiritual crisis, where anger at God mirrors the same hopelessness and alienation found in severe depression. Misanthropy. Misanthropy is a distrust or hatred of humanity as a whole. Depressed people sometimes slip into misanthropy when disappointment, betrayal, or isolation calcifies into a worldview. Instead of just, I'm worthless, it becomes everyone is worthless, which can ironically feel protective. Easier to reject the world than risk being rejected by it. Historically, philosophers like Schopenhauer have leaned heavily into misanthropy, blending it with pessimism about existence. Clinically, misanthropy often rides alongside depression, social withdrawal, and cynicism. Ressentiment. Nietzsche's term ressentiment describes a corrosive, festering resentment born out of powerlessness. Instead of confronting it or overcoming obstacles, the powerless redirect their bitterness inward and outward in toxic ways. Depression has a lot in common with this, that gnawing sense of injustice combined with helplessness. Unlike ordinary anger, resentment lingers and mutates. You replay slights, failures, or humiliations over and over until they become a part of your identity. Psychologically, it's close to rumination, but specifically flavored by bitterness and envy. Black Dog. Black dog is a metaphor for depression that goes back centuries but was popularized by Winston Churchill, who used it to describe his own recurring episodes. The image works because it captures depression as a presence that follows you, sometimes lurking, sometimes pouncing. It's like a shadow companion that never fully leaves. The phrase is still used in mental health campaigns worldwide because it captures the stubborn, haunting nature of depression in a way that clinical terms don't. Antinatalism is the philosophical stance that bringing new life into the world is morally wrong because existence inevitably involves suffering. Thinkers like David Benatar argue that life's pain outweighs its joys, so the kindest act is not to create more life. And then for people with depression, this philosophy can resonate strongly. It validates the belief that suffering is universal and unavoidable. Schadenfreude, a German word meaning pleasure in another's misfortune. On the surface, it doesn't sound depressive, but here's where it connects. Depression often warps self-esteem so badly that people look outward for proof that they're not the only failures. Seeing others stumble can briefly soothe self-hatred. Psychologists suggest Schadenfreude can be a defense mechanism in depression. If everyone else is failing too, maybe you're not so alone. But it's a bitter relief, one that reinforces negativity instead of healing it. Amok syndrome. Running amok comes from this syndrome first described in Southeast Asia. It involves sudden outbursts of extreme violence after periods of brooding or withdrawal. Historically, it was considered a culture-bound syndrome, but it has parallels in modern psychiatric diagnoses involving dissociation and depression mixed with rage. For some, depression doesn't just turn inward, it explodes outward. Intermittent explosive disorder, or IED. IED is a psychiatric condition where people have repeated episodes of intense impulsive aggression that are out of proportion to the situation. It's not bad temper, it's a loss of control tied to dysfunction in the amygdala and serotonin regulation. While not always linked directly to depression, there's overlap. Chronic irritability and bottled up despair can manifest as sudden explosions. In depressive contexts, IED highlights that anger and sadness are often two sides of the same coin. Psychological projection. Projection is when you attribute your own unwanted feelings or flaws onto others. For example, someone who hates themselves might insist that others secretly hate them too. In depression, projection is simple. Low self-esteem and self-hatred get externalized, so the world feels hostile even when it isn't. Freud originally described projection as a defense mechanism, but in practice, it makes depression worse. If you assume everyone thinks you're worthless, you'll avoid people, which reinforces hopelessness and isolation. That was layer 7, guys. That means we only have 2 left, so it's gonna get pretty crazy from here on out. And again, please make sure you're safe. Hope you're enjoying the video, and let's continue. Diogenes syndrome. Named after the ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes, though ironically he lived intentionally minimalist, Diogenes syndrome describes a severe form of self-neglect. People stop cleaning, hoarding piles of garbage, isolating completely, and refusing help even when living in unsafe conditions. It's often linked to late life depression, dementia, or trauma. The psychology behind it is complex. Part apathy, part shame, part refusal of societal expectations. Algolagnia, a clinical term for deriving pleasure from pain. In the context of depression, algolagnia can sometimes surface as maladaptive coping mechanism, redirecting emotional anguish into physical sensation. While not inherently pathological, in consensual contexts, it overlaps with BDSM and isn't a disorder. In depression, it can veer into self-directed harm. The brain's pain and reward systems overlap in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, which explains why pain can briefly quiet despair. But the risk is when this slips from controlled coping into compulsive self-damaging behavior, and it's never okay to cause harm to yourself. Misophilia. Misophilia is an attraction to filth, dirt, or uncleanliness. From a psychological lens, when tied to depression, it can represent surrender, rejecting hygiene and order because of deep hopelessness or self-disgust. Some researchers see it as related to Diogenes syndrome, where neglect spirals into comfort with squalor. Depression doesn't just strip energy, it can warp values, making unclean environments feel like a comforting mirror of internal chaos. Kodo Kushi, a Japanese term meaning lonely death, referring to people, often elderly but increasingly middle-aged men, who die alone and go undiscovered for long periods of time. It's a cultural tragedy tied to social isolation, shrinking family structures, and untreated depression. Kodokushi has become a recognized social phenomenon in Japan since the 1980s, and it represents the ultimate end of depressive isolation, not just being forgotten while alive, but vanishing silently in death. Picarism, a rare and disturbing paraphilia involving, actually, maybe I shouldn't actually cover this one. Don't look it up, my fault. It's bad. It's something that, anyway. Ubasute, a Japanese folklore, also, I don't know if I pronounced that shit right, bro. I'm sorry. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I might be racist, but Ubasute, a Japanese folklore / legend about the practice of abandoning elderly relatives on mountains to die, usually during times of famine. While historians debate how often it actually occurred, the story persists as a symbol of despair, duty, and loss. So yeah. Eroguro, short for erotic grotesque nonsense. This is a Japanese art literary movement that fuses horror, absurdity, and sexuality. It's not just about shock, it's about the interplay of beauty and decay, intimacy and violence. So I guess for depression, Eroguro resonates as a cultural reflection of how despair twists desire and aesthetics into something uncanny. Autophagia. Autophagia literally means self-eating, compulsively biting, chewing, or consuming parts of one's own body. I don't know if it has to do with depression because I do this. I bite like my little finger skin off sometimes. Eat it. Is that weird? Am I gonna get fucking canceled? At its mildest, it can look like chewing nails or skin, and at its most severe, it becomes dangerous and destructive. It's linked to extreme stress, obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders, and sometimes depression, when self-directed aggression takes physical form. So yeah, this layer is pretty quick too, because a lot of these I couldn't cover. Obviously, look at this layer, bro. I can't cover some of these. And also looking at the last layer, I don't think I'm gonna try to cover it, guys. You can research it on your own, but it's not something that I want to cover in this video. So yeah, that covers the depression iceberg. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this maybe was able to do some good. I don't know. It's just a silly iceberg video, but again, I hope that it can help us people who don't have depression kind of see people that do have depression a little bit nicer, and kinder, and be more relatable to them and understand them better. Because this really does, take place on a physical level. It's not just, go outside for a walk. This is real. Thank you for watching, guys. Have a great day. Please stay hydrated. Do not do anything bad to yourself. Sleep well. Good night and sweet dreams.